Mind Body Connection podcast.
The body and mind.
With your host, Dr. Phil Parker. Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Mind Body Connection podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Phil Parker, and today I've got the incredible pleasure of speaking to a great friend and mentor of mine, Judy DeLozier. She has been around the field of personal change and development since the early 70s, hanging out with the founders of NLP in California and some amazing people, including Gregory Bateson and Milton Erickson. We're going to talk to her about that, about her life and things she can teach us from her deep experience of understanding the mind and the body from a particularly unique perspective. So a very warm welcome to Judy DeLozier. I hope you enjoy finding out from someone who's been there, who was there at the start of many of these things, meeting some of these incredible people, learn something interesting that makes a difference to you. So welcome, Judy. So lovely to see you. Always a pleasure. One of my quiet heroes. So much stuff that you've done, which I've covered in the introduction already. Great to have you on this podcast, which is all about the mind-body connection. So that's the mind, the body, and how they connect. So I start with this kind of basic question with most people, which is, so for you, how do you define the mind-body connection? How do you think about it? How do you explain it to people?
Well, I always kind of think about the idea, first of all, how is it not connected? It's like, how could it possibly not be connected? Otherwise, I would be this like floating head, just kind of moving around. I think, over time, we began to think of mind as something that is brain as opposed to something that's produced by this living organism. And I think that's a difference that makes a difference. When people think of mind, quite often they think of brain. And when I think of cognitive mind, I think of up here, that space behind my eyes, when I'm thinking, right? As opposed to mind being something that's produced through the pathways of every signal that's sent out through the organism. So can I think in different ways? Yeah, I mean, I can think cognitively, and I can think also with my body. Sometimes I say to people, if you're trying to do something and you're very clear up here, that's what you want, but you go for it and something stops you, who's in charge of the house there? where, as they say in Greek, Pios kani commandos to spititu, who's in charge of your house? I mean, I'd say there's something underneath. And what is it underneath? It's that whole underlying system that understands a set of connections called, my body. And also the biggest connection all is the fact that the nervous system, the spinal cord, doesn't stop at the neck. It goes all the way down to the tailbone and innervates the whole body. So the whole body is a thinking mechanism. So the idea that there is a split between the mind and body is only an idea that the conscious mind can have.
Yeah. I mean, I think even the conversation, the mind is in the brain. Well, as soon as you say that, you're already stepping into anatomy, aren't you? If the mind is in the brain, then the mind and the brain connect. I mean, it's, as I say, pretty much at the beginning of every podcast, it's kind of a trick question, really, because as soon as we have the word connection, it suggests they are two discrete entities.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where Bateson would say it's an error in epistemology, right? It's an error in our thinking that leads us down a certain pathway. And that pathway is to make the underlying assumption that they're somehow not connected. And that's erroneous, because you can't do without the other. You can't have one without the other. I guess you could think about it like nicotine. There's like a lot of ways that you can take nicotine. Like what do they call it? What is the way in which you can smoke the cigarette, or you can do a patch, or the delivery system? It's like the body's not just the delivery system for something else. So I agree. It's a trick question.
And it's one of the reasons I started this podcast was I came across some people on social media, and I was talking about the mind-body connection. They were going, it's all nonsense. There is, it doesn't exist. And I was like, that's such an interesting.
What?
Yeah. interesting position, but they were like, no, you can't. Basically, their argument was you can't affect the body with the mind. And there's no evidence for that whatsoever. And there's been some great examples. I'd be interested to hear what yours is, but there's been some great examples of people on the podcast so far saying, well, here's my best example. One was Dr. David Hampton, who said to a guy who said there's no evidence of the mind-body connection. He said, well, when you get excited by looking at pictures of naked women or imagining naked women, is there any physiological response in your body to that? And the guy went, oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah. I mean, the fact that this is an interactive, systemic, this is a system, and it's all connected. And it's just a question of where I put my attention.
Yeah.
To me, it's just a question of attention. Yeah.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the early days of NLP, which you were involved in I think the 70s. I want to talk a little bit about your contribution, and I'm assuming that it was massive, particularly because of your major is in dance, if I'm right in thinking. Is that right? That was what you were studying?
No. My master's degree and my bachelor's degree is in comparative religion and anthropology.
Comparative religion and anthropology. But you are a dancer, aren't you?
But I did dance. Yeah, I did dance for a lot of years. Yeah.
And so I'd be interested to know how much of your input of that had on the development of NLP from your perspective, how important that kind of physicality is. I want to talk a bit about Bateson, your next door neighbor, and Erickson, who you hang out with a bit. So much to cover. So let's begin with you and movement. And, is that a part of your heritage that you brought that into this conversation in NLP, do you think? Were other people interested as well?
I mean, I can certainly say from the very beginning or quite early, as representational systems kind of unfolded more clearly about representational systems, that, it was kind of obvious about the visual system and what that meant and what you could do there, and also the auditory digital system. But the tonal and the kinesthetic were much less sort of developed in my thinking in terms of the way we could talk about it or how we could use it. And at that time, in my memory, it was almost as if when we talked about the kinesthetic system, the physical system, it was talked about as basically a vessel that held emotion, as opposed to a whole system which knows how to learn, which has memory, which codes and decodes information, which understands the relationships of parts in ways that my cognitive mind only understands the linear aspects of parts, right?
Yeah. So let me just clarify some of this, because some people won't be deeply familiar with representation.
Please.
So representational systems are basically, and you can correct me if I say this wrongly, is how we process information or how we store information. So there's a visual, which is what we see. So either what we see externally when we look out of our eye windows, or what we process inside of our head in terms of visual images of movies. Auditory then is the voices or sounds that we run either internally or being aware of external stimulus. And then there's the kinesthetic, which is, as you kind of say, is almost like a thought of it being a bit more primitive or a bit less advanced. And I was talking about this weekend. So we were saying that because people have a tendency to use one more than the other in certain environments or situations, they'll tend to lean on one heavier than the other. And we were talking about which one do people tend to favor. And the visual one's very interesting, because if you go into a room in half a second, you can pick up so much information, just scan the room. If you're trying to talk what was in the room, so to have a speak, you would just be you'd have 2 seconds, 1 second, it wouldn't convey much information. And kinesthetic, you've got to go and touch it or sense it in some way. So we can process vast amounts of information visually. People are very familiar with that. Auditory, we're quite familiar with, but kinesthetic, the feely bit, which includes not only sensation, like touching things, it also includes sniffing, olfactory, gustatory, those kind of things, which are again considered to be kind of like almost like lizard-like behaviors, kind of low-level invertebrate behaviors. and then sensing, what's our sense of this. So,
Yeah.
So that's just filling in for anybody listening about what these sensations are. And you were saying there was a kind of an awareness of visual and auditory, but the kinesthetic was.
Yeah, I mean, we have this whole system that we go, if we want to take language, for example, or internal dialogue. When I talk to myself, or person talk to myself, we have this thing called language, which is a code. It's the way to talk about something else that's happening in this system, or in this outside system, or in my relationship with that system. But there's all that is, according to Bateson, like 8% of the conversation. There's another whole conversation going on, and that's what the body is doing. That's speaking a different language, but it's a primary language as opposed to a coded secondary language. So even with that visual system, yeah, I might be taking that information in, but I'm taking in information that is released through the body, and that is mine. That's talking as well. As my friend in Japan used to call it, that's the other conversation. There's two conversations, and when people get out of whack, it's like one conversation doesn't quite match the other conversation, and people walk away going, something wrong with that picture. I don't know. And I didn't feel so good with that. So if I can give you an example, the body has memory. It's called some people get post-traumatic stress. That's memory. The body remembers that. And I can think about it like crazy up here.
Yeah.
Oh, I wish it weren't happening. I want it to change. But I have to understand that that's a different conversation. And how I relate to that conversation in myself and others is really what it means to be embodied. It's about having the awareness in my body. I broke my arm on a horse when I was probably my early 20s. And it was one of those really nasty breaks, with 3 weeks of traction in hospital and heavy casts and nuts and bolts and all this. And like 20 years later, I'm getting a massage, and this masseuse says, "What did you do to your arm?" And I broke it 20 years ago. She said, "When are you going to get the cast off?" Because I was carrying my shoulder lower as if that was still there. The body does have memory. If it didn't remember things and code them in certain ways in our past, or even the anxiety to the future, right? What is that?
Well, because also we although we may have cognition about stuff, we feel it not in our minds. We feel it in our stomach feels sick, our heart races. There's an output from that into the tissues, into the muscles, into the
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
vice versa.
And I think, if you look at something like the heart math at Stanford, I think there's other things going on too. I just was talking to a doctor in Berlin recently about how much influence, that has on our kinesthetic system. And as part of what the whole leveling up is going on, this leveling up so that I can bring my whole system up out of the survival strategy modes of, fear and aggression and binary thinking, because my body's signaling me like crazy, do something different. It's not up here going, oh, I better do something. My body's going, I can't breathe, right? It's kind of a no-brainer, really, for me.
But it's also, as you know, I worked as an osteopath for a long time, and one of the things that makes people go and seek medical help, osteopathic help, is when their body doesn't work anymore. Their body won't do stuff anymore. They can put up all sorts of stuff, but when they can't move anymore, or when everything hurts, then finally they wake up and go, oh, I need to pay attention to this. But the problem they have is they don't have a very good dictionary or language to understand, what does this mean? What's going on here? Yeah.
And I agree with that. And I think the first thing it is that it's a signal, and when in that development of that illness or anxiety, when were the first signals that you didn't pay attention to? That's what I always kind of go there. It's just a signal system. It's there to remind me to do something. If my toe hurts, it's saying, I need something. something needs done here, but we just override those signals in our busy life. Yeah.
So what got you interested then in this kinesthetic, the more physical, somatic body language? What intrigued
Well,
you?
I really wanted to honor it as a full-on system for learning, for coding, for decoding, and for memory, and yeah, so that if I want to learn something, I can also step in and use my body in that process, as well as I can watch and see what's happening, as well as I can listen to a set of rules. Because in reality, if you look at who are those children in school that are considered slow, quite often they're the kids who learn through their body. You've been a trainer. I've been a trainer for a long time. You're doing training and somebody says, could I see that process like 5 more times, please? You've had people go, well, what would you say if somebody asked this question? And then you have the people who really learn with their body who are going, can we just do it now? We just do, because I learn by doing. And I just think that we have kind of cut that off in some ways, especially in the educational system, which is all very visual.
Do you think we're also in a bit of a danger of that at the moment with, our conversation, luckily you're in America, I'm in the UK, we can do it through Zoom, but with COVID, everybody is, well, certainly most of the people I know, working with clients, having conversations, are doing it this way. And that's very visual, very auditory, but not very kinesthetic. There's not much movement. We're sat down a lot of the time, staring at the screen for hours. We don't connect with people. It's amazing how much information we can get without those systems, channels available. But do you think that's an issue if this keeps on going? Because people are getting familiar with Zoom and going, oh, this works. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword. It gives us a great opportunity, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity that I can connect, to my world community. And at the same time, as they said at Harvard Medical, sitting is the new smoking. So, take good care and do things with some wisdom and balance. It's the tools we have now. I'm grateful for the tools we have now. I'll be so happy to get back to being able to get on an airplane and come visit you and have a proper hug. At the same time, I go, wow, can you imagine if we didn't have this tool right now? So I have a lot of gratitude for that.
It reminds me of some guys I knew 15 years ago now. They developed this technology. They're really interested in technology and wearable technology. And this thing called I think it was called the Hug T-shirt. And it had a little bit of technology here, right? So if you were wearing your Hug T-shirt and I was wearing mine and we were like connected through some kind of network, then when you stroked your arm like this, my T-shirt on the other end would just get me through it.
Now we need that now. Now we need that, but they say there's certain things you need to stay healthy, and touch is one of those, so at least touch yourself. Or I have a dog here, and a couple of birds and guinea pigs. So I have things to touch, but it is important.
Virginia Satir said something about hugs, didn't she? You need like a certain number to watch.
10 a day. 10 a day, just maintenance. That's just maintenance.
Just to survive. So
we are social creatures. We are social creatures.
Yeah. Let's move on then to Bateson. Tell me, what do you want to tell? I would imagine many people listening to this wouldn't have heard of Bateson. He's not that well known, I think, generally. People don't, if you say the word, most people, I don't think, would know much about him. He was very interesting. I was reading a bit about him today, about his dad,
his family,
His dad was like a William Blake scholar, wasn't he? And a premier biologist, I think.
Yeah, he rediscovered Mendel's
that's right, Gregor Mendel
research and coined the word genetics. Actually,
coined the word genetics, yeah. And he had an interesting relationship to science and art. He thought science, this is William, the dad, science was proper and art was interesting, but not a real career and that kind of stuff. And then he had 3 sons, I think. One who died in the First World War, one killed himself.
One committed side,
Yeah.
and Gregory, who he really wanted to be a biologist, and Gregory didn't want to be. And my understanding is that the field of anthropology at that time was about 20 years old. It was quite a new discipline when he was a young guy, and that one of the mentors or teachers that he had said, you might like this, you know, you might like this anthropology stuff. And so he went in that direction, and then of course met Margaret Mead, and then that's a whole nother story. But what I loved about Gregory Bateson is that for me, he was a Renaissance man. And he was a Renaissance man in the sense that he covered so many spaces, so many different disciplines, I should say, because he had this obsession with the pattern that connects. How is like one thing like another? How is like the leaf of an oak tree like a rock? How can you look at something and tell that even though it's in a rock form now, that at one time it was a living thing? I mean, he was always looking for these patterns. So he had biology running in his veins, no doubt, in terms of his deep appreciation for the living world, but also in systemic thinking. So if I look at, Virginia Satir's like the mother of systemic constellations. She really is. She started that business. And Gregory, was just a person who thought so big, thought systemically, and the connections in the system. And I think had a deep awareness that in reality, everything runs through our nervous system. So it's all questionable. Yeah, beliefs are useful, but they're not necessarily true.
So one of the opposite positions, I think, would be the kind of scientific reductionism, which is kind of dig deep to understand the mechanism of the clock, if we understand how all the bits work, then we can understand how the watch works. That's the kind of the model. Yeah. And I think Gregory was thinking differently, wasn't he? It was more like, as you say, how is that like that? What's the connection between these things?
Yeah. I mean, that whole idea of mind and nature, I think that we can say things like mind body split, and it's a cognitive idea, it's a concept, which is not based in anything, but it causes us to act as if a certain way, right? Even though, right? I think the same is true of this idea of mind and nature. We forget we are nature. We just are, and as opposed to in it or out of it, we are it. And that mind and nature reflect each other. I mean, that was one of the deep points, I think, that touched my heart.
Tell us more about that. Mind and nature reflect each other. What do you mean by mind, first of all, compared to nature?
Well, when I look at a tree, at the University of California, we have oak trees, and occasionally these oak trees get attacked by a certain moth. And when this moth attacks one tree, this tree emits a signal to other trees to protect yourself. This moth is coming. That signal that is sent through the mind of that tree is mind. And mind, we send signals, is called mind, and it reflects nature. Any living thing produces mind. It sends signals. My favorite one, as a doctor, I love this one. I always thought vitamin D was just a vitamin, you take the vitamin, but no, it's how we're like a tree, because it's this deep relationship between the cells and the sunshine, and this magic transformation that happens that releases something my body needs. To me, that's beautiful, because it reminds me that I'm like a tree that way.
I think we'll come on to this later on, but I think it's a big conversation and question how much we have stepped out of remembering that we're part of nature. And instead we use nature as a resource. We mine it, we drill it, we burn it, and now here we are, in this place.
Yeah.
It is unsustainable.
No,
carry on doing what we're doing. And it's
yeah,
partly, again, it's a little bit like the mind-body split. It's like seeing ourselves as separate, that we are not
yeah,
in any way connected to this, in a way
yeah,
that indigenous native cultures never
yeah,
could allow themselves to think that way, because then they would, rape the soil and kill all the bison, and there would be nothing to eat. And
yeah.
somehow we've managed to get ourselves into this hole.
Well, I always said, from being from religious studies originally, and well, still am. In fact, a lot of my friends are still trying to get me up to Berkeley, to get a doctorate in church, Judy. No, I don't think that's going to happen. But that deep awareness, I always said the first prayer probably that was ever uttered was, when somebody killed that bear and leaned down and took in that last breath of the bear and said, "Thank you, because today I eat you, tomorrow you may eat me."
Mm.
That I understand, this the sacredness of that breath and the fact that I get to continue to live. I mean, we've thrown that out a long time ago, but not in the more traditional, that was the sky gods coming out of, the Great Rift Valley and overrunning the goddesses,
Well, certainly in the Native American tradition, I know that's one of the things they do, isn't it? When they take an animal or
yeah,
even vegetables to eat, they say
yeah,
thank you for
yeah,
for your gift that sustains us, and that
yeah,
brings an awareness, doesn't it, to that, rather than this mass-produced. Open the box, box of frosted Cheerios, that come
yeah,
from the Magic
yeah.
Frosted Cheerio factory somewhere over there, and we don't think about it in any way at all.
No, that's it. I mean, I remember talking to kids from big cities that they never saw a cow in a complete form except in a picture, maybe.
Mm.
So, it's hard to have a sense of connectedness to the life of something when you only see it in bits and pieces in a grocery store.
So coming back to Bateson, so did you study with him? Was he like a lecturer, tutor, or was it just like a friendship because you were neighbors?
No, no, he was a professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz for quite a while I was there. We lived in a commune kind of thing. It was the 70s. And Robert Spitzer, had a big piece of land up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and he had Science Behavior Books was the first company that produced, that published any of the NLP books. The Science Behavior Books was the company that published, I think, the first NLP book, actually. NLP Volume 1, I think, and some of the others. So there were a bunch of houses up there, and there was John Grinder and myself, and there was Gregory Bateson living across the street with his wife and his daughter, Nora, who was a young girl at the time, little girl. And then there was a 3 out of 4 of the High Tones, which is a very famous jazz quartet that lives in Santa Cruz, or lived in Santa Cruz at the time. And so they lived there. So he was a neighbor. For many students, he was their professor. But I can remember, we would talk about things, and he read, which one did he read? Was it, I guess it was on the meta model. I'm trying to remember if it
Structure of Magic, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, The Structure of Magic. Thank you. He read The Structure of Magic, and he loved that book. He loved that book. And, I remember him asking John Grinder at the time, who was a linguist. He said, do you think I is the biggest nominalization of all? I remember him saying that to John, and John goes, "Oh, it's a pronoun." I'm going, "Oh my God, this guy's brilliant," because underneath that tiny little word, he's pointing to this whole deep structure that lives in the whole rest of this underlying system. We might call that the body, that's embedded, ingrained in all kinds of things in there, and beliefs and values and ideas. But I remember that being, for me, kind of a pivotal moment.
I better just explain to people who don't know what normalization is.
Oh, okay, please go for that. Yeah.
So,
Is it the biggest frozen fish we have?
so normalization is a bit complicated but fascinating. I've written that book about it as well, if you want to check it out, called Judy. But a normalization is a verb, which is a doing word, a process, something that is occurring in time and space. So like if I dance, you see me dance, and when I stop dancing, there is no more dance. And it would be crazy to say to me, if Judy said to me, "Hey Phil, I love your dance. Where do you keep it when you're not using it? Can I borrow it?" I go, well, it doesn't exist in that shape and form. It's not, because dance is a noun and dancing is a verb. We should say, "Lovely dancing, Phil," not "I liked your dance," because dance doesn't exist in that way. And the real test from NLP is, the question you ask is, can you put it in a wheelbarrow of indeterminate size? So you can't put dance in a wheelbarrow. You can't, it doesn't show up like that. You can put the moon, and you could put this cup, and you could put Judy in a wheelbarrow, because these are nouns, normalizations are verbs, which sounds like a strange thing to be bothering talking about, but it is really important, because as soon as we noun it, it creates this staticness, this stability. Exactly. So we say, I have this anger inside me. I feel this anger. We're talking about it like a thing. And the same with disease. When people talk about, I have diabetes, that's not actually accurate. It's a process. And as soon as you name it as a noun, it becomes very stuck and difficult to change. If you can keep it as a fluid process that comes and goes and stops and starts, we've got more chance to kind of get in there and shift it, because it's more temporary, it's more variable. So that's why it's important. We could talk about that for hours, but that's just explain what normalizations are. So you said
I apologize for using that code word, but you're right. What he was trying to say is, aren't we really more of a process than a frozen thing? And that in that process, we're interacting with another living world, and two living worlds interacting is going to create constant process. So this thing called I is really something that is potentially changing all the time, unless I'm trying to hold on to a certain idea very, very tightly.
Yeah. So it is a really interesting thing that he says, talking about this possibly almost the smallest word, A and I, probably only two.
A and I.
But what it encompasses, it also reminds me, I was reading a bit of Buckminster Fuller, and he has a book which is called I Appear to Be I Am Not a Noun, I Appear to Be a Verb.
I'm not a noun.
Yeah. Which is the same conversation. Do those two cross paths at any point, Bateson?
I don't know, but they were certainly contemporaries in a way. They would have overlapped for sure. I listened to Alan Watts, who I still adore. I don't know if you ever listened to Alan, but when I listened to Alan Watts, I feel like, he and Gregory must have spent hours and days and months talking to each other, because I hear such similar ideas and sensibilities, coming.
Did Gregory know Aldous Huxley as well? I know Erickson did.
Oh, I do believe so. Yeah. I do believe so. Yeah.
I think
Aldous Huxley, of course, knew Gregory. Knew Milton Erickson, and also Aldous Huxley knew Aldous knew Milton Erickson, as well as Bateson knew Milton Erickson. Yeah.
I even think I read that Bateson introduced those two, and then
I think Milton, that's probably accurate.
Milton went to hang out with Aldous Huxley, and they were going to write some kind of book together because I think Aldous talked about when he was creative, going into some kind of deep space and so Erickson was very interested in that from a trance perspective, and they did some work together. And I think then Aldous had a fire and his library is destroyed, and he was distraught about it and didn't want to talk about it anymore. And I'm sure there's it might even be a book that you wrote, one of your books, Patterns of Milton Erickson, I think it might be, where he talks about he's sitting in the library with Aldous Huxley, and he says, I'm going to pick a book, I'm going to read, I'm going to open it randomly on a page, and I'm going to say, what's the first word on the page? And trusting his unconscious mind, which had read the book, would somehow pull it out, and he managed to do it. Is that one of your books?
No, I don't remember that. I remember him Altus, going into this deep trance and sitting on the edge of a cliff in a trance, and he's sitting on the edge of the cliff, and the only lifeline connection he has is only the sound of Milton's voice. That was his, his connectedness, in a way, as I call it, the lifeline that allowed him to take this very deep journey into his own, inner world. I remember that. And then Gregory went with Margaret Mead to talk to Erickson about trance before they went to do their work in Bali, trance work in Bali as anthropologists. And then it was Gregory who wrote the original letter for Richard Bandler and John Grinder, to go and meet Dr. Erickson.
Yeah. Interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Through all that. Interesting time. So let's talk then a bit about Milton Erickson, who I find a fascinating person. I never met him. I was in Phoenix roughly around the time he died, bizarrely enough, as a young teenager. I think he died in 82, I think.
1980.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gregory, Milton, and my mom all died in 1982. And 1980. And so I figured they had probably reorganized all of heaven pretty quickly.
So you spent some time I'm right in thinking, with Milton Erickson, staying in his little guest house. Is that right? So
I did not stay in his guest house, although other people did, because John and I were staying at a hotel, or I was staying at a hotel.
But you hung out. You hung out with him.
We hung out. Yeah, we definitely hung out.
So some people won't have heard again of Milton Erickson. Probably quite a lot of people will, because they've heard me talk about him before. But if you were to describe him firsthand, because mine's only secondhand, firsthand description, how would you describe him? Why is he of interest?
Well, first of all, I would describe him as very intriguing. I mean, because you meet this, when I met him, he was 76. When most of us from NLP, I would say all of us from NLP, it was from the time he was 76 until he passed away. Beautiful, elder, white-haired man, dressed all in purple, which he said it was the only color he could appreciate. So in the wintertime, he would wear sort of that dark, rich purple. And in the summertime, he would wear more lilac, a light purple, in a wheelchair, extraordinarily observant, and very, very sweet and very tricky.
Tricky in what way? Tricky.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was a man of his time. He was a man of his time. He had a pretty rough road to hoe, as we would say. He came out of that time in where people did, what do you call it, where you lay on analysis, where you were doing analysis. That was sort of what the structure at the time was. And he said, look, I want to get on with my life. I don't want to spend 7 or 8 years on an analyst's couch in order to decide whether I should get married or not. I kind of want to move on with my life. And so that sort of motivated him into this idea of a briefer therapy, in a way. And, he was a doctor. He pushed people's edges because he was a pioneer, very much like Virginia Satir was a pioneer, pushing the edge of the known model at the time and getting backlash. I think they tried to take his credentials away at least once. And then he became, very, very famous for his ability to use altered states to help people change. And he would get people who were at the end of the line, everything else they'd tried and failed. And they would find themselves, with Milton. And you can go back to the 50s and you can see him doing absolutely beautiful, official, ritualistic hypnosis as defined at that time to be done, in a therapeutic setting. When I met him, he was just telling a short story after another short story after another short story. And you knew very well he was talking about you, but there was just this ambiguity because he wasn't using your name. So I can give you an example.
Yeah.
So, it was always kind of a joke that people would go to visit Milton Erickson and then they would go away and someone would go, wow, this guy changed my life. But most of the time people would go away and go, yeah, it's an old man, told a bunch of old stories, who cares, but their life would change in these beautiful and amazing ways. They didn't necessarily always reflect it back, but many times they would write him a note, well, I'm married and have 4 kids now. Life is so beautiful, right? Da, 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 da. So John and I would go to visit him. And John would say to me, call Milton and let him know that we're coming. And I go, okay. So I'd call up and he would go, who is this? Milton would say, who is this? And I'd say, this is Judy DeLozier. He would go, I can't recognize you. Not, I don't recognize you. I can't recognize you, right? Oh, I live with John Grinder. Oh, okay. Okay. Right? No, this is a man of his times. That's how I say it. Beautiful guy. But he had ideas about how life should be.
So what was he trying to say? That you guys should be married? And is that what the message
like that? Something like so this goes on 3 or 4 times, right? So finally John goes, well, call Milton. I go, no way, you call him, because every time I call, I have to go through this crazy, thing. And he goes, well, just say you're Judy Grinder. So I call and I go, hi, Milton, this is Judy Grinder. Oh, come over immediately. So when we arrive, he meets us outside and he gives me this bouquet of flowers. And he asks John to push his chair over by the Palo Verde tree. And he asked John to kiss me under the Palo Verde tree. Now, this was his way of being okay with this relationship, which for him, I think was a little bit outside what,
Yeah.
And then he began to tell these interesting stories. These 2 young psychiatrists came to him once and they wanted to know if they should, live together or should they get married? And I didn't know. So like he just, it's these short little clips, all of them sort of sending this message. And towards the end of his life, that's how I saw him work was, he would just this sort of a foot in both the conscious world and the unconscious world, and having a person stand and hold in that space and make the connection through the system. It was very beautiful. Yeah.
So a lot of people talk about him as non-authoritarian hypnotic process instead of saying give up smoking. But do you think he was trying to get you to get married, or just get you to look at that? What do you think his take on it?
Yeah, I think probably both at the same time. I think, to look at that, but also I think, in his world, that was the appropriate thing.
Mm. We had a thing that he had a kind of stages of life, didn't he? That you would be a kid, then you'd be a teenager, then you'd fall in love, then you get married, then you have kids, then you become a grandparent. Yeah. And if any of those stages were missed out in his model, then problems could ensue. I think that was one of the.
Yeah, I think things like that, where just when I say he was a man of his time, and
he must have been born in. When was he born? When would he been born?
Well, in 1900.
Yeah,
1900. If he died in 1980, he would have been born, and he was 80.
Yeah, so he would have lived through the Great Depression and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And interestingly, he was married twice, wasn't he?
He was Carol. He had Carol, his first daughter, by his first wife, and then he married Betty, and I think they had 4 children. Oh no, wait, he didn't have Betty. Betty was not from his first wife. No, Betty was his second wife, and they also, I think, had a daughter named Betty.
Oh, okay.
Carol was his daughter from his.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character. He did lots of, you say, radical, revolutionary things, some of which are quite, really? and other things which are quite amazing. And certainly one of my favorite books, which I'm pretty sure you are co-editor or author of, is the Hypnotic Patterns of Milton Erickson, which is where it breaks down his language structure. So there'll be actual transcripts of what he said and then what it meant. So you would have a sentence and what it meant. And sometimes the sentence would be on the left-hand side and then description be on the right-hand side. And it will be one sentence and there'll be like 6 pages of explaining why he's chosen that.
The importance of that. I mean, when I think of something like now, when we talk about timeline therapy, for example, that there's a whole sort of TM, timeline therapy. But, that's where I learned timeline therapy, to be honest, was with Milton Erickson, because he very much would go, go into a special space, allow yourself to go along life's highway, go back through this highway. Maybe somebody shows up because they're going through a difficult time and it hurts and it doesn't feel good. And he'll go, well, let's go down life's highway. We'll go back in time, find something that you got in trouble for before the age of 6, because you couldn't do anything very bad before the age of 6. And, you're probably going to get a spanking for that, and it probably will hurt worse, before than it does during or after. And then this just becomes sort of a whole model for my thinking of change personal history. This becomes a whole model for my thinking of re-imprinting. This comes a whole model from my thinking for timeline therapy. It was, from my personal experience, I thought it was all there.
Yeah, he did a lot of that stuff. There's a story, I think, about the November Man. I think that's what it's called. The
November Man.
Yeah, which is this kid who I think didn't have a dad, or dad left or something, and he always regretted he didn't have a dad. And then he took him, created an imaginary man who would visit in November.
Yeah. And I think the out story or the backstory was, this was a person who wanted to have children and be a parent, and said, I have no skill because I didn't have any parent. And he created this character who, came and became a parent for this person over time, so that they had that knowledge, so that it gave them the freedom. I mean, those are beautiful things. And from a neuro-linguistic programming point of view, we're able to model some of that out, really.
Because one of the things he's doing there is, instead of that model of, well, your history is what it is and tough shit, he's like, well, the first thing is, our history is what we remember it to be. Our history, our recollection of what happened is often quite wonky from what really happened. So
those are those great fragments of history that get held together with the belief somewhere along the line.
But if we're going to, have a slightly inaccurate version of history, it might be better to have a more useful inaccurate version of history that might inform about the future. And that comes against, the model that he would be working, other people would currently be working from, the kind of psychoanalytical model, psychodynamic model of go back, feel experience how awful it was, and so you learn something. And going, well, maybe that's just a model that maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, maybe there are other ways to look at it. And I think he was quite revolutionary in that as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I always say I think he really, really was. He was really, pushing a frontier. He was really pushing an edge of development. I think Virginia Satir was too. I think in many ways Gregory was too. Gregory maintained even at the University of California, they would try to give the California huge amounts of money to the university to get him to do research, and to do research on something quantitative, to do a quantitative kind of research on something that was a qualitative thing by nature. He would go, you're crazy. You can't do that. And it would drive them crazy at the university because they want the money, of course, They go, no, I won't do it.
So we said we're going to talk to you for about half an hour. It's been much longer than that, as always. And I don't want to take up any more of your time, but to finish with, it's been fascinating talking to you as ever. And so it's really one of the things there's so many things I love about talking to you anyway, but it's really nice to talk to somebody who was there, who does know, who did meet Erickson, who did hang out with Bateson, who has that connection. That's a really important thing. So thank you for sharing them.
My pleasure.
If you were to look at everything you've learned, and you have learned a lot and taught a lot and developed a lot of things, it's a slightly impossible question, but if there was one thing that you wanted to share, this would be my top tip. Out of all the things I know, this is my giveaway. This is this is something I would come back to again and again and again, what would it be?
I would say, do not forget that the model that you have of whatever it is a model. And models by definition are limited. And you base the model on its usefulness, and be prepared to allow it to expand or let it go at any moment. I don't care what model it is. A model is just a model. It's a description of the world that allows us to move forward or not in a certain way. And never forget that the model is not the world, and the world is extraordinary out there. And whether it's inside or outside, it's full of symbols, it's full of mystery, and it is full of breath. So that's what I would say.
That's lovely. And that's obviously, we were talking about this before we started recording. We're recording during this weird time in America where the election has kind of been called, and some people say it isn't there. The partisanness within the American society at the moment, and how the hell that's going to resolve. But I think that is what you've just said is the answer, isn't it? If people can really get that everything I think is my best grasp of understanding stuff, but be prepared that maybe that's my best understanding based on what I know at the moment, and when I know more, it may be different, and be free to not be nailed into that.
Yeah, and if it involves something like we were talking about, a potential conflict, I have to rise above the idea that it's an either or situation, and just acknowledge the fact that both may be true, but I'm neither truth. I'm bigger than either truth, and I can think bigger than either truth, and anybody else can as well. Because binary thinking just creates polarity. Polarity creates conflict. And and again, I just have to start, and this is very Bateson for me, I have to think more systemically. And if I go, yeah, those are both true, but what else is true? There's a lot more truth, and there's deeper truth. And I guess that's what's important right now for me, is to keep looking for that deeper truth.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Judy. Great to speak to you as ever.
And you, Phil, I love your smile. It just makes my heart just, just to see your picture, when it would come up on the link. I love that guy.
Well, look, we'll see you soon in real life.
I hope so. You take good care over there. Give everybody you can a hug from me. And okay.
Thank you very much, Judy. Brilliant. Great to speak to you. You take care. Have a good day, yeah?
Yeah, and you. Have a good evening. Ciao.
The Mind Body Connection podcast.
The body
and mind.